Hey, good morning. Looks like another day. I got to confess that I love summer. I just absolutely love summer. I mean, when I was younger and I used to ski a lot, I always looked forward to the snow and the cold, and it was my endorphins would flow when I think about hitting the slopes. Now that I don't do that much anymore, I love summertime. I just love the sun. And I think a lot of it has to do with that all the vitamin D and the rays really kind of help you to have more optimistic thoughts. So I just love it. I love going out early in the morning and opening my Bible and sitting on my deck and reading the scriptures and just talking to the Lord with the birds chirping in the background. And I don't know where your situation is, if you're able to do that, but if you can, please take advantage of it. And because as my wife often reminds me, this is only going to last for a couple of months, and then the cold is going to return, and we're going to feel isolated. Hopefully, our governor doesn't decide to shut us down any longer as we go into the new year. I have this funny feeling that once the election is over, the pandemic suddenly is going to get immediately better. But that's just my opinion. I may be completely wrong. But we've been talking about the prophet Elijah and the role that he played, how he came at a pivotal moment where Israel was on the precipice of really kind of going off the cliff and falling deep, deep into the worst and the most corrupt kind of idolatry, which was represented by the worship of Baal and Ashtoreth. Ashtoreth was his consort, we'd basically say his god girlfriend, who he did all sorts of ribald things with. But I don't want to spend a lot of time on that. But the whole point is that when I read this story, I often think about the time that we're living in right now. When I teach on this passage on Mount Carmel in Israel, one of the things I always start the message this way. I say, quoting from Charles Dickens' Tale of Two Cities, talking about the French Revolution. He said it was the best of times and it was the worst of times. And in some ways, that was what was going on in the kingdom of Israel, the northern kingdom. They were at one of the highest points of their power, their might, their wealth, their prosperity. There's all sorts of comments about just the kingdom of King Ahab. So here's Ahab married to Jezebel, two of the most reprehensible people in the Old Testament story, and yet they're prospering beyond all limits, until God decides that he's going to intervene. And in a moment, he has the prophet Elijah pray that it would stop raining, and it did. And you have to understand that Israel is a land that depends upon rain. It's not a river culture like the Mesopotamian countries of today of Iraq and Iran, where they have the Tigris-Euphrates River. But it used to be in the times the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Persians. It wasn't a river culture. It wasn't like Egypt, which has the Great Nile River. They couldn't, in other words, use the river to irrigate. If it didn't rain, there was no water. There are no major water sources. The only major water source really is the Jordan River that flows from the north to the south, but it's so deep in the Jordan Valley that there's no way to really draw the water up. And so they had to rely upon what we call dry farming. God promised them, he said, if you're faithful to me, I'll give you the former and the latter rains, or which basically means I'll give you rain in autumn and I'll give you rain in spring. And so what he would say is, you go out in the autumn and you plow your fields, you plant your grains, and I'll bring rain that'll germinate the seed. And then right before the harvest time, I'll bring rains in the late winter, usually in February and March. Those rains will come, and that'll give an extra spurt of growth to allow the harvest to be bountiful. And the Lord said, basically, if you are faithful to me, I will give those, but if you are not, I'll take them away. Someone once quipped as saying, well, this is a weird description of the promised land. They often think about Israel as being almost a desert country, and it's hardly that. There's really very verdant and beautiful parts of Israel. But basically, because of the years of neglect and rebellion against God, the land became denuded of a lot of life. It became a real desert. Today, the Israelis who are living in the land have restored it, and now it's one of the most fruitful places on the planet. The amazing prosperity and wealth is something that really is not only notable, but it kind of drives the Muslim world crazy, because they're supposed to be the ones who are most blessed by God. And yet here, right in the middle of what formerly was Muslim land, they have this very powerful, rich, wealthy, verdant, intellectually and academically and technologically and scientifically and medically advanced cultures on the planet. And that's why right outside of Tel Aviv, they have a little town of I can't even remember the name, but nonetheless, there's a small town which basically is the second Silicon Valley, they say, where a lot of even iPhones and other things of that nature are developed. So anyway, I digress a bit. But the whole point is that God interrupted this moment of great blessing, power, and prosperity, and he humbled the kingdom of Israel to bring them to a place of repentance. And it's really interesting. It really comes to a head when Elijah really tells King Ahab, let's really have a contest. Let's see who is really God. And this is interesting because we often say, I wish I lived in a time where God would reveal himself in such powerful ways. But you have to understand that the reason why God acted in such dramatic ways was because it was the only way to get people's attention. Their hearts had become so clouded by the false theology and the corrupted religious systems. Their minds had lost contact with the Word of God. In other words, they weren't living in a biblical culture, even though we would say they were living in a biblical time. These people didn't know the Bible. They didn't have priests and prophets who were teaching them the Bible. And so as a result, they were drifting very, very far from God. And so God really creates an opportunity to really prove who is truly God. And that's where Elijah says, have the prophets of Baal, 450 of them, meet me on Mount Carmel, and basically we'll build 2 altars, and we'll offering our sacrifices to the altar, and whichever God answers by fire, that is the true God. And I don't want to get too far ahead of the story, because really what I want to focus on is when Elijah confronts the people of Israel, basically the general population. It's an interesting passage we read in chapter 18, where it says, so Ahab sent a message among all the sons of Israel and brought the prophets together at Mount Carmel. And Elijah came near to all the people, and he said, how long will you hesitate between 2 opinions? If the Lord is God, that is, if Yahweh, the God of Israel, if he is truly God, if he is God, follow him. But if Baal is the true God, follow him. And then it says, but the people did not answer him a word. How long, he said, will you hesitate? The Hebrew word that's really used there is interesting because it means basically to walk with a limp. He says, how long will you limp along in your faith and not really run after God and commit to God? It speaks of kind of attentiveness, a cautiousness. Well, yes, I believe in the Lord, but I don't want to go crazy. I don't want to completely put my trust in him, because what if he doesn't come through? What if he doesn't answer my prayer? What if I surrender myself completely to me and I don't know the power and the joy and the victory of God? In other words, we're talking about a time that personally I think is very similar to our own time. What we have in America is basically a Christian heritage, but we don't really necessarily have a Christian faith. We find that Christianity has become an institutionalized organization, which is very significant. I mean, there's 300,000 churches in the United States today. And yet, most of them find that their members are leaving. They're getting smaller. You can count probably on a couple of hands how many churches are really growing, and especially growing exponentially. And they tend to be churches that aren't real deep into the Word and are great upon having highly experiential movements, so that, they're more, they have a high entertainment value. But unfortunately, sometimes that means they don't have a high worship or reverence or service value. And I don't want to sound too judgmental because I don't even want to begin to identify where that's at and where it isn't. But the simple fact is that what becomes lost is this kind of personal encounter with God. And when people aren't having a personal encounter with God, they try to substitute it with all sorts of sensational encounters. And I want to go into that a little bit next time, about how that sometimes we try to stimulate the flesh in imitation of the worship of the Spirit. But essentially, the question that Elijah asked, I think, is a question that really applies to our day today. How long are we going to be tentative in our pursuit of God? You see, it's not surprising that a non-Christian looks at most Christians and says, well, they're not any different from me, and I don't see them really committing themselves. I believe that most Christians or non-Christians are looking for something meaningful to commit themselves to, and yet too often Christians aren't that committed. You look at their life and there's really nothing unique. I mean, they don't read the Bible, they don't pray, they go to church if it's convenient or they feel like it, but they're not really committed to a community of believers. That's one of the reasons why I think there's a real danger that as we go through this season, we'll find many Christians will prefer just to watch it on the tube. You'll follow it on YouTube or on the internet or some other form because they don't really see a value in joining together with other believers. And unfortunately, many times, a gathering of Christians can be one of the most lifeless things on the planet because people are more interested in talking about other things, politics, economy, their latest surgery, than they are talking about how God is ministering and working in their lives and seeking to minister to the lives of others. Well, some thoughts to give you to really kind of challenge you. Are you one who's hesitating between two things, that you're really not sure anymore if Jesus is really God, or maybe he was just a great teacher who came in history? What is unique and distinctive to you about Jesus? How would you answer that question if a non-Christian said, what's so special about Jesus? What would you say? And would it be something that they would look at and go, I want what you have? Well, didn't make it mean to give you a lot of homework and make it super challenging, but gosh, we need to have these kind of honest conversations with ourselves. And usually that means we end up having an honest conversation with God too. So anyway, catch you on the other side tomorrow. God bless you.